And then I'm going to click OK. Okay, for this next part, I'm going to click the preview button. I'm going to show you. When we press to go to the ship, our player walks right through the ship. We don't want that. We want the player to collide with the ship. So I'm going to click this X button to get out of here. So how do we do that? That's actually fairly easy. When we add a condition, we're saying when something happens, right? Do something. Or same thing with a sub-event. The sub-event is just dependent on this. For this, we want something to happen when we're in collision with the ship. However, we want this we want Gdevelop to look for this constantly, not particularly at a particular instance other than when the player's in collision with the ship. So if you want to have Gdevelop constantly look for something, you leave this blank. So we're going to go to Add Action. We're going to go to Common Action for all objects. Then we're going to go to Position. If you want to make something be a solid object, there's multiple ways of doing that in Gdevelop. We're going to choose this way. Separate two objects. We're going to select the player first. It's important which is on top here, which you select first, because this is movable. This will be not movable here. So we have the player selected first, or up. It's up on the screen here. So the player will be movable. The second object will not be movable. So we're going to click here and then select the ship. And then we're going to click OK. Okay, so now we have that set up. Let's try this out. So now we have our player walk up and pressing the arrow key. You see our player does no longer goes through the ship. So now what we are about to do is we're going to press the Z key. And what we want to happen is the player to go to the interior of the ship. So I'm pressing the Z key now. And now we have the player inside of the ship. However, when the player walks, we want the camera to move with the player. We also don't want the player to be able to walk through this space right here, just to be able to walk through the rooms. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that up now. Kind of looking at my player animation, looks pretty good. So I'm going to click this X button right here. And yeah, so we are currently in scene 1, the events. So right here is where we set up our artwork. Roll the mouse wheel to zoom back, and events is where we're setting up where we set up our programming. Okay, see how we have this say pause the scene and start 2? That pause is important, and you'll see why later. Okay, so we need to go to scene 2. So how do we get there? We don't see scene 2 here. What we do is we go to our upper left, our project manager, we left click here, and then now we can see here's scene 1, here's scene 2. So now when we left click on scene 2, we can see here is where we work with our art in scene 2, and where we click to events, now this is where we work with our programming with scene 2. So I'm going to click here to temporarily take away this project menu. Okay, so what we see here is the work copy from scene 1. What we're going to do is click here. Remember, we click here, we lose our ability to click this sub-event button. We click here, we have our options. So we're going to click the plus button here. What we need to do is we need to have a way to get back to the exterior of the ship. So we need to set up a collision here with the ship as well. So we're going to, not with the ship, we're inside the ship. We need to set up another collision though. So we're going to put an event here. However, we need something to collide with. So we're going to click 2. I'm going to hold the middle mouse button to pan the view. So we start here. So what I'm going to do is click here. I'm going to select sprite. I'm going to name this button. And then I'm going to click this plus button right here. Now in Gdevelop, we can go to here, this other plus button. This is how we would bring in graphics. However, in Gdevelop, there's something called Piskel, which is a graphic design editor built into Gdevelop, which is spectacular. So we're going to click Edit with Piskel. And we're going to actually make a button that we can bump into or collide with, I should say, that will allow us to go back to the exterior scene. So we're going to click here. I'm going to left click and drag on this blue, left click and drag here. I'm going to go to this paint bucket, click here to fill this square. That's all we really need. I'm going to name this button. This isn't necessary to name this. I just chose to name it button. It's easy to do, so why not? We're then going to click Save. So now we have our button. We don't need to have anything set up for this button. We can click Apply now. Okay, so with this button made, what we're going to do is left click here, left click and drag this button out here. We're going to put this right here. I'm just changing the size to make it wider. And what we want to do is we're going to make it so that when our player walks back and collides with this button, we can press another key to have our player go back to the exterior view. Okay, so I'm going to go to events. I'm going to click here to move that out of the way. We're going to go to this event here. We're going to click Add a Condition, Common Conditions for all objects, Collision, Collision again. We're going to select Player. We're then going to go to Object and select Button. This is the button that we just made. We're now going to click OK. Okay, so now we want a sub-event of this. Remember, the sub-events are dependent on this. We use sub-events because that way we only have to have this one time. So with this selected, where we can see the blue outline around it, we're going to click sub-event. So then with the sub-event, we're going to go to Add a Condition. This is where we're going to set up to have our button pressed. We're going to go to Keyboard, Key Pressed. We're going to choose the M key. And when we just choose the key, a lowercase M is fine. We're going to click OK. We could have also scrolled down through that menu. Okay, so now we say, okay, when a player is in collision with the button, as well as the button being pressed, we want something to happen. So we're going to click Add in Action. So we're going to go to Scene. So what we want is, and this is important, when our player starts off in Scene 1, the player walks across the screen, goes up to the ship, and then the player presses the button to go into the ship. If we didn't choose this where we say stop and go back to our previous scene, and previously we set up pause and start a new scene. When we went back to the scene, you would find that the player was away from the ship, which looks kind of strange. With this setup, the player will be right back where the player first enters the ship. It makes things look correct. So we're going to select stop and go back to previous scene. Then we're then going to click OK. Okay, so what we're about to do is test this out. Now, one thing that's important with this, because things are set up to work from 1, if we start a preview here, we're going to start in events 2. Now, this says go back to the previous pause scene. There has been no previously paused scene if we start in 2, so this will not work correctly. So to have this work correctly, be aware you have to go to the project manager menu, click 1. We need to start from scene 1, so we need to preview from here. And this will allow us to work correctly. I just want you to be aware of that. If you start the preview in scene 2, things will not work correctly. So you want to start in scene 1. I'm rolling my mouse with a zoom back. So now that we're here in scene 1, I'm going to click launch preview of the scene. So I'm using the arrow keys to walk across. So we're here at the ship. We're going to press the Z key. I'm pressing now. There we go. So now we're in the ship. So now we can walk around the ship. We're in our interior ship. Now we want to go back. So we're going to go back to here. We're going to press the M key. And now we are back to the exterior scene of our ship. Okay, so when we click on scene 2, now I'm going to click here to temporarily take this away. while we won't be able to, if we preview from here, we won't be able to go back to the previous scene. If I click the preview here in scene 2, because we're on scene 2 events, when I press the arrow keys, you can see that we can travel through the ship. However, the camera doesn't follow the player. So if we want to actually travel, we actually basically walk off the screen. So what we want to do is to fix that now. So I'm going to click this X button to go out of the preview. Then I'm going to click here. So now we have this highlighted, this event highlighted. Okay, so with that highlighted, we're going to click here to make a new event. We want this event to happen all of the time. So remember, conditions say when something happens, do this. We want this Gdevelop to pretty much do this all the time, which is going to be track our player. So when you want something to happen particularly all the time, for the most part, you don't put a condition. You leave that empty. So now we're going to click Add Action. We're going to go to Layers and Cameras. Then we're going to go to, we have normally, you might want to put on center the camera on an object. However, we're going to use center the object on a camera within limits. So we're going to left click here. We're going to select the player. So we're telling the camera to center on a player. For here, we're going to press 0, 0. For this, we're going to enter in 1920. And then for the Y, because that's the X position we did that. For the Y position, we're going to enter in 1080.